Hello Alex, there's something that I've always wondered about. I do have a basic idea how an exhaust condenser works on a steam engine. I don't mean a beam engine or a big mill engine, but the little ones. I make exhaust condensers that condense the steam to water and keep the oil in there, and then you can empty it. It's very convenient, and all that goes up the chimney is steam. The alternative is that you pipe the exhaust up the chimney, and not only do you get a watery mess at the bottom of the boiler, all of the oil starts making a noise like a fish and chip shop, which is no good. What I would like to know is, how do they really work? And I'm sure there are a lot of viewers out there who share my doubts as to how they work.
Right, so I'm really glad you asked me this question, because there's a lot to know. But the big thing is, and again, don't take this as shade thrown, I just want you to know, your method of condensing and your purpose of condensers is not the true purpose. So yours is being essentially a condensate and oil trap. It's a pot for the wet stuff to land in before anything can go up the chimney or make a mess. But we use condensers for much, much more than that. And I don't just mean getting the water that you've gotten back from the steam in return to the boiler. A true condenser will increase the power of the steam engine, and I don't mean a little bit, I mean significantly. In fact, so significantly that in the days of the Watt engines, the days of the Newcomen engines, where the steam pressures were minuscule, like under 1 atmosphere, almost all of the meaningful horsepower of these steam engines were generated on a vacuum under the atmosphere produced by the condenser, not from the pressure coming from the boiler. In fact, some of these early engines where the boilers were made of wood or stone, and I mean the pressure vessel, I'm not even kidding you, before they had gotten iron boilers, the pressure was nothing. The pressure was zero. The steam would travel to the engine like vapor travels, out of your kettle. And only would you develop power on the vacuum stroke. And even into the days when the steam pressures were +1, +2 pounds per square inch, this was the case. The first principle that you need to know about condensing steam, right, is that a condenser of any kind, you need to think about it as an anti-boiler. Very simply, when you have a unit of water and you apply enough heat to that water to fully boil it into steam, if this is not confined in a closed space, this wants to get 1,600 times bigger in size. And if you have that cloud of steam at that size and you collapse it by cooling it into water again, it wants to contract 1,600 times its size, okay? Now, if we exchange that open space for a confined space, if we're turning the water into steam, the confined space is known as a boiler. So if you boil the water in the presence of a confined space, some of it will boil until a tremendous pressure is generated, at which point it will reach kind of an equilibrium of water and steam, which you see in the sight glass, until you let it out to do something. And in a condenser, when the steam enters this confined space at whatever size it is, and then it is cooled by whatever mechanism, because there are several different types of condenser, it wants to collapse in volume, but because it's in a confined space, an immense vacuum is created. All right, now, so the first steam engines, we're talking the 1700s, Newcomen and Watt. The steam was admitted under atmospheric pressure. The piston was returned upward by the beam. The weight of the pump on the other end of the beam would be pulled down by gravity, because the pump and all the pump jacks weighed a heck of a lot. So the piston would be pulled up, the steam would be let in under basically no pressure at all. It would be let in from this boiler that was under hardly any pressure at all. The steam only had enough pressure to get to the cylinder, not drive it. And when the piston was up and the cylinder was filled with this warm steam at no pressure, the valve was closed and an injection water valve would open, and water from somewhere, even just by gravity from a location above the cylinder, would be sprayed inside of the actual steam cylinder. The water would hit the steam, it would collapse it, a huge vacuum would be created, the piston would be drawn down, and the pump jack would be lifted up, and the engine, which was usually on coal mine pump duty, would lift a charge of water with it, and then you'd repeat the cycle. This was direct inside the cylinder condensing, and the trouble with this was all of that rapid heating and cooling of the cylinder and piston would cause binding. It would fracture the cylinder or the piston quite oftentimes, or the piston rod. It was very destructive to the steam engine, despite how efficient it was. Cornish cycle steam engines. And these consisted of an engine with 3 valves, the open admission valve, the equilibrium valve, and the exhaust valve on the more modern, where the condenser is separate from the cylinder, but the really old engines. Watt eventually created an engine that had an admission and an exhaust steam valve, eventually for both sides of the cylinder, and a condenser that was separate to the cylinder, where this spray of water was always being discharged into the flow of exhaust steam coming out of the engine cylinder and continually collapsed. This refined the condenser into an appliance instead of a part of the process in the cylinder. The engine wasn't getting destroyed by direct injection of cold water anymore. And this eventually became known as the jet condenser. Now, I need to describe the entire process of this to you, because let's just say we have an engine. It could be any engine at all. Just in the case of a jet condenser, an empty chamber with a pipe coming from somewhere. The pipe comes in through the wall, and inside there is some kind of a spray head, because if it just came through the wall in a hole and the water stream poured to the bottom, it wouldn't be very efficient. But our goal is to spray the water in lots of little droplets into the entire steam cloud to collapse as much of the steam as possible with as little water needed. And then in this case, the condensed steam that collapses into water and the additional cooling water we've injected fall to the bottom. The condenser is a closed vessel. When the steam from the engine comes into it, it collapses 1,600 times in volume, or more if the steam is a little bit above atmospheric pressure or temperature, corresponding saturation temperature. And then what happens is the vacuum created by the collapsing of the steam. The vacuum is not created by a pump or any of this stuff. This is where a lot of people get it wrong. The real vacuum and the continual creation of more vacuum comes from the steam coming out of the engine being cooled and collapsing. Now we have to get the condensate and the cooling water out of the condenser without destroying the vacuum. This is where an Edwards pump comes in. And I'm going to ask that you cut the video and bring me the triple. The separate condenser is affixed to the side of the steam engine or somewhere else even, but it consists of a closed chamber. The closed chamber is connected at the top end to the exhaust of the engine. In this case we have a marine triple. No better way to show off a condenser. The condenser doesn't exist on this. The wet air pump does, but the condenser doesn't exist. So we're going to pretend right now that we have an old-fashioned Watt jet condenser. It would be a closed chamber, very simply, and with one pipe coming from somewhere else, either above or below the engine, with a small cooling water pipe that comes in through the side of the chamber, and once inside there's a little spray head. It wouldn't be efficient if the water just entered through a hole and fell to the bottom. The goal is to cool as much of the steam as possible with as little water as possible, so we want something that sprays an atomized mist of water or droplets of water all around in there, so that the steam going from the top down has to hit water on the way down. When the steam is cooled sufficiently by this spray of water, it collapses in volume over 1,600 times. Because it's in a closed space where no air can enter to fill this void, a tremendous vacuum is created. We're talking something like 25 or better inches of mercury, whereas the total vacuum is 30. Now, in the bottom of this closed chamber, otherwise closed chamber, the condensed steam, which is now water again, will land in the bottom along with any of the cooling water that's sprayed in through that head. Our challenge is now we have to get it out without destroying the vacuum of the condenser, because the vacuum, which we will talk about later, is adding a lot of extra horsepower to this steam engine, a lot of extra horsepower. But in any case, we need to get the water out, the condensate and the cooling water out. That is what this pump is for. You will see on all the big beam engines, all the compound and triple and quadruple, and in some cases more expansion marine engines, all of these power plant steam engines that you find, these sort of bucket-shaped pumps. Now this is called an Edwards pump, and I want everyone who watches your video, I want everyone everywhere to know what this is, because a lot of people don't know what this pump is for, because in the hobby scene and stuff it's rarely used. In fact, a lot of the time I've seen these engines, marine engines, put in model boats that work and go across lakes, and this pump is just along for the ride, out of service, not connected to anything, because the engine's running and the exhaust steam's going somewhere and they think, well, that's good enough. The Edwards pump is the integral part of actually operating the condenser, whether it's a jet condenser or a surface condenser. A jet condenser does not need a cooling water pump because the cooling water is drawn up by the vacuum of the condenser. In fact, when you start the engine, it's the Edwards pump itself, which is a vacuum pump built to handle wet wet gases that starts the condensing jet, because the first few revolutions of the engine, that pump makes a few strokes, which is just enough, if it's tight and everything is arranged right, to suck enough water up that cooling water tube like a straw to start the cooling jet in the condenser. And as soon as the exhaust steam comes out of that engine, instead of flooding and pressurizing the condenser, it begins to collapse. This creates a bigger vacuum which draws more cooling water up to the jet condenser, accelerates the process, the engine will then turn faster, and away you go. The Edwards pump itself consists of a bucket-shaped piston inside this bore. The piston itself is also a check valve. Sometimes in a big one where the piston is like, 4 feet diameter, there are many check valves, but in other ones like this model, it'll be like a rubber flap that goes across the whole thing, or 3 or 4 little rubber discs on springs. The bottom of the pump is a little well. It is connected to the bottom of the condenser, which will be appreciably above the bottom of the pump. So anything in the condenser falls into the bottom of the pump by gravity. When the piston comes down, the check valves are open, because these check valves face upward, open for things traveling upward through the piston, and closed for anything trying to go back the other way and into and toward the condenser. On the bottom of the condenser, there will be a pipe leaving and then immediately a check valve. We call this the foot valve. This is the first step of protection to stop things from destroying the vacuum of the condenser by coming in the other way. Now, after the foot valve, we go from there directly to the bottom of this pump. Anything in the condenser will go through the foot valve, which is a one-way valve going from the condenser to the bottom of the Edwards pump. And anything that's in the condenser will then fill this bore. With the Edwards pump piston at the top of the stroke, you see here it's connected right to the engine's low-pressure crosshead. It's driven by the engine. It's very important. Water from the condenser, if there's any, will be up to a certain level in this cylinder. Can be any level at all. And when the piston comes down, remember the piston is also a check valve. And on the way down, the checks in that piston open, and the piston travels right through that charge of water until it hits the bottom. Now we're ready to begin what's called the suction stroke. With the piston at the bottom and a charge of water above it, when the engine begins to lift the piston, the check valves in the piston slam closed, and any water above it comes with it in an upward direction and out the discharge pipe, and it goes to wherever it's going. We'll cover that later. And at the same time, while it's discharging that charge of water that it's got, it's also, because the piston is now a piston with closed check valves, it's also going to draw the next charge of water from the condenser through the foot valve, which is opening one way this way, into the bottom of itself. And the key with this pump is, it can generate a higher vacuum than the condenser can. So if the condenser can make 25 inches, this pump will be able to make darn near 30, like almost a total vacuum. The vacuum in the condenser is not being created by the pump. It's being created by the continuous collapse of steam into water from the cooling action. The pump is only removing the condensate to stop the condenser from flooding with water completely, and also not allowing the vacuum in the condenser to be destroyed, because we have 2 check valves. One is the piston, the other is the foot valve to protect it. Once we finish discharging, then we send it back on the charge stroke with the piston going down again with this next charge of water that was just drawn in. The piston is going to travel down through that charge of water again with open check valves to the bottom, where we repeat the cycle. And the nice thing about this is it's self-regulating. If the condenser completely dries out of water and there's only steam between it and the bottom of the pump, we can lose the vacuum. And if the condenser floods with water, it will stop working completely, because the steam and the cooling water won't be able to get inside. However, if the condenser is cleverly placed vertically in relation to the bottom of this pump, if the condenser has a high level of water in it, the pump will fill totally, and the amount of strokes that the pump makes per minute will remove quite a lot of water, because it will fill to the top level of the pump immediately every stroke. If the condenser is at a low level of water, just the last bit of it is filled with water, only the smallest amount of the pump will be filled with water, and only small amounts of water will be lifted out. So if the condenser is filled with water, the water will be removed from the condenser faster. And if the condenser has very little water in it, the water will be removed from the condenser slowly, which is why we call an Edwards pump system self-regulating. It's a brilliant design. Once we've completed this process, now we have to put that water somewhere, right? The goal with this is to increase the power of the engine, which we've now done by creating a vacuum. Our second goal is to reuse the water that we just used as steam. We've condensed it, now we want to put it back in the boiler. That's the other advantage. And of course in a ship, this is very important. If the ship is traveling the high seas where the water is salty and not usable in a boiler, it is very important to recapture as much of our condensed steam as possible and use it again. The Edwards pump is a useful pump because not only can it fight a vacuum, but it can lift a decent way. We're going to go from the discharge of the Edwards pump to something called a hot well. On the shipboard, it's called a hot well. In a power plant, it has another name. The old name would be the feedwater heater-purifier, and in a modern power plant, we call this the De-Aerator. But in the simplest form, it's a tank or a box. And it forms a reservoir from which we can feed the boiler. So our boiler feed pump right here, the wet air pump's next door neighbor usually, or our injectors, will take water from this hot well. And in its more complicated form, the hot well consists of a box with a couple of automatic regulating float valves to govern its water level, and a live or exhaust steam preheat coil or jet or something like this, or series of jets to heat the feed water up to make the working of the plant economical, or oil separators so that any cylinder oil coming out of the steam engine going through the condenser and back into the system can be separated, because we do not want oil going in the boiler at all. It's a very bad thing, which we can cover later. But the hot well in the simplest form is a box, it's a reservoir. And it's a nice thing because this pump, like I say, can lift, and the best place for a hot well is somewhere above where the pumps or injectors are, to help prime these pumps or feed them water by gravity and prevent cavitation. It gives you a little bit of what we call net positive suction head, which is very important. And the reason we call it a hot well is because even if our condenser works almost perfectly, the water coming out of this will still be fairly warm. It won't be ice cold. And the water coming back will be at, if we're talking Fahrenheit, 80, 90, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and you'll find that the water in this box is somewhat hot, so we call it a hot well. And this is good because if we're using pumps, we'll talk about the injector problem later, the hotter the water is before you pump it into the boiler, the more economically the steam power plant runs, and the less you harm the boiler by shocking it with cold water.
I was always taught that the triple expansion engine used steam 3 times, and at each time the steam expanded as it cooled. But I don't think that is right, is it?
Well, it is right, but the only trouble is you're thinking about it backwards. Instead of thinking that it expands as it cools, it's that the steam cools as it expands, if you see what I mean. Because what the goal is to get the heat energy of the steam turned into mechanical energy at the crankshaft, right? And we do this by expanding the steam, and it will cool because as we expand the steam in the engine, the heat energy is removed, and we can see this by the drop in temperature.
Give me the rule again, because 1 or 2 viewers wrote in saying, no, it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that.
There's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings out there, but the thing that we need to know, I want to cover 2 things, the steam tables and Boyle's law. Boyle's law is very simple. Pressure and volume have an inverse relationship, so as pressure goes up, volume must go down, you have to compress, and as pressure goes down, volume must go up, it will expand. Temperature and volume have a direct relationship. Temperature and pressure have a direct relationship. When one goes up, the other goes up with it, and when one goes down, the other goes down with it. So when you expand, when the volume goes up, pressure goes down, temperature goes down. That's Boyle's law. The reason I've created this drawing is to illustrate to people once and for all why condensing matters, why we care about the pressure curve of steam, the specific volume pressure curve, and to dispel all the misconceptions once and for all. We've taken this beautiful little Stuart triple and tilted her on her side so that you can see the relationship of the sizes of the cylinder bores. Now, we're going to start with this corner of the diagram. Please excuse my fingerprints, but I work on these engines so much that it's kind of permanently in my fingers and it just doesn't go away. In any case, on the steam table is a bunch of numbers. What I have done is I have converted this bunch of numbers into a line for anyone who thinks visually, because math's really are kind of training wheels if you can't ride the bike, if you know what I mean. This is a visual representation of the specific volume number curve on the steam table. VG, column VG in any steam table. Look it up and you'll see here from left to right we have high pressure coming down into a vacuum. This line's the absolute vacuum. Here's the atmosphere that you and I are breathing right now. The size that the steam wants to be, the space that it wants to occupy, is quantified by volume. Ignore units for right now. This just gives you a visual representation. Between 200 and 100 psi of boiler pressure, you can see it increases very little. Between 100 and the atmosphere, we have somewhat of an increase. Underneath the atmosphere into vacuum, we suddenly have an immense increase, parabolic. And you will see the thing that makes the engine work, the process of the heat engine, is the expansion of the working fluid. So as the steam gets bigger in the cylinder and cools and drives the piston, this is where we obtain meaningful work from the steam engine. So the goal is to make the size increase as large as possible and the temperature drop as large as possible, because only now are we getting the most amount of heat energy we put in from the fuel out at driving the crankshaft. If we do not condense, we only get this much of that curve. We can only ever get that much because it's ending at the atmosphere. And quite often we can't even get that much because due to restriction of the piping, the ports within the engine between the cylinder and the valves, the shape of the valves, the amount that the steam changes direction on its way through the valve, etc., will cause restrictions in the exhaust steam flow, which will cause, instead of getting all the way down to the atmosphere, it'll actually go a little bit up in pressure. We call this back pressure. It's harmful to the operation of any steam engine and any engine at all, actually. You'll hear about this in the hot rod communities who tune up car engines and things. This is why they do things like polishing the inside of pipes and ports and making valves larger and making camshafts open valves for longer. It's all to eliminate back pressure and increase the free flow of gases. This applies to steam engines as well. Now, to that end, you'll notice I've drawn on the right here and down here. Non-condensing steam engines only can take advantage of a small part of this parabolic specific volume curve. So I have here the bores of a typical triple expansion steam engine, which are not that different to each other. There's not really that much appreciable size difference between the high and the intermediate pressure, and there's only a little bit of a size increase really between the intermediate and low because it follows the curve. And also here on our indicator diagrams, the indicator is an ingenious device which we should make a video about, which is a mechanical instrument that shows the cylinder pressure over the stroke. It's a mechanical graph drawing device which we use to test the horsepower, the valve events, and the efficiency of steam engines. If you have any condensation in the cylinders, as all steam engines will develop, especially if they're not superheated, whenever the valve opens to the exhaust of the condenser and is exposed to the vacuum of that condenser, any condensate in that cylinder, that hot cylinder, will instantly re-evaporate and leave as steam. So a condenser will also greatly help you eliminate condensate from knocking the engine and banging on the heads. Also, something to know for anyone out there using a condensing engine. You might think you're ensuring the safety of the steam engine by opening the low pressure cylinder drains periodically or leaving them open until the last. But actually what you're doing when you open the LP and IP drains for a long period of time, because of the vacuum, you'll notice nothing comes out of them. Air is going into them and is actually destroying the vacuum of the condenser. So on a condensing engine, you have to handle it a little bit differently. You have to think about any air leak at all. The tiniest air leak, for instance, instead, the packing glands won't be trying to leak steam out, they'll be trying to leak air in. So even if you don't see the water droplets and steam coming out, you'll think it's a tight packing gland. Not necessarily, because the steam won't be trying to leave. The air is going to try to come in, especially on a low pressure cylinder. You need to make sure it's airtight because air cannot be condensed, which is why this pump is called a wet air pump. It also removes air that comes in the steam from the water being boiled. But any air that goes into the condenser in appreciable amounts will hamper its ability to operate. So it's very important to make sure the engine is steam and airtight everywhere and that you don't leave those drains open for too long. Just enough to get the water out, and that's it. So just a quick little PSI to anyone out there who might own an engine like this, an owner of a Stewart triple or Bolton triple or any compound engine or whatever. If you have a wet air pump, use it. Make a condenser if you don't have one. Here's why. If you're driving your boat across a lake right now and you're just using this beautiful multiple expansion engine to exhaust to the atmosphere, you are wasting over 2/3 of that engine's horsepower and speed potential. And you will find if you put a condenser on that engine and you deluge it with cooling water correctly and you have your wet air pump working right, the horsepower of that engine may increase by 160% and your boat will go much faster.
Can you explain what the small pump in the centre is?
This one here?
Yes.
A boiler feed water pump.
Really, I never knew that. I thought that was the condenser coil filler upper.
Right, no, so actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I'll make a very quick aside. No, so this pump here, it's a boiler feed water pump. You see how it's a very small bore and the distance isn't all that great. It's just to the engine crosshead. This pump is made to feed a bit of water against a very high pressure into the boiler. The condenser requires a deluge, a high flow at high speed of very cold water. This pump is not sufficient. For a jet condenser, the condenser's own vacuum pulls the water up and into itself and sprays it in, so you don't need a pump for that. However, for a surface condenser, like on a ship, we can't use the salt water to cool the condenser because it'll go in the boiler with a jet condenser because they mix. A surface condenser is the other type of condenser. It's literally an anti-boiler. It's a closed space, as I said before, but there's lots of tubes going from one end to the other with water boxes on each end. You supply water to one box, it goes through all the tubes, it flows into the other box and out. To correctly operate that setup, you need a little engine next to this. So for this engine, it would be something with a cylinder a fraction of the size of this high-pressure cylinder, like almost a half or third scale 10V. Driving a centrifugal pump at very high speed. And the pipe coming out of that centrifugal pump would be something like this big, going through that condenser's cooling tubes and out, just out over the side to drive as much of that cold water outside the hull through the condenser as possible and out. And then that wet air pump does the job to lift it from the condenser to the hot well and back to the system. So you need good cooling. You must have good cooling. This is for boiler feed water. This is to drain the condenser. You need a separate cooling water pump and engine or a gear drive off this running the centrifugal pump to cool the condenser.
That has been illuminating, to say the least. A couple of minor questions. Two types of condenser. An injector condenser and the other one. With the surface condenser, you need a separate pump to pump the water through
the cooling tubes.
The cooling tubes.
Correct.
But the thing that puzzled me was, I'm thinking about injectors. I've just been rebuilding injectors at 2000 psi. But no, the vacuum sucks the water in through the nozzles.
Correct. Of the jet condenser.
That's ridiculous.
If you have it working right, it will even lift water from a significant distance below itself. It'll suck it up like a straw. So the condenser in a mill engine could be above the cooling pond and it'll suck it up. Now,
just like drinking a McDonald's milkshake.
Correct. Now, in some cases, if your wet air pump doesn't pull that good of a starting vacuum, before the condenser has a vacuum in it, you may require a small pump to shoot water through the jet. But once it's working and the condenser has a vacuum in it, you can bypass that pump completely with a couple of bypass valves and it'll just draw right from the cooling water source. But if you really want to make sure the condenser can always start, simply have the cooling water source placed above it, and when you open the cooling water valve, it will flow in by gravity at a certain speed and get enough out the jet to begin the cooling process.
It's very clever.
It is. And keep in mind, this was created by a man in the 1780s.
And if you think what was happening in the world in 1780, no airplanes.
No.
Horses.
Although, funny you should mention airplanes. The steam injector, that device which confounds so many people, the thing that puts the water in the boiler with the same pressure of the steam that's in the boiler to put the water against that pressure in the boiler. This was created by a man named Henri Giffard, whose other claim to fame was building the first steerable, powered, manned aircraft in 1850, a steam-driven airship with a marine engine hanging under it with him in the basket, and he had no accidents with this aircraft. And he turned around and by intuition then invented the steam injector. God bless the French.
God bless Andre Chapelon.
Yes, that too.
Fantastic. Well, that has been so illuminating, and I really thank you for the explanation. I'm splitting this, as you've already gathered, because this is the end of episode 3, into 3 sections. Not because I think people out there are stupid, but it took some sinking into me, and I'm far from stupid. And I think if we do it nice and slowly, in 3 gentle episodes, then the penny will drop. And if it doesn't, you can go back to episode 1.
Sure. And I'll make drawings for you of the condensing system so that other people who watch you, who are model engineers, can make them themselves and test them.
And don't forget that if you want to see the full-length versions of these videos, no, don't you wink. You
Sorry.
Support on a platform like Patreon really is important to creators like myself and for also Alexander Karnes. There is no possible way I can put the hours in to make the videos that you see me make. I have over 3,000 on YouTube and quite a lot more on Patreon that are not on YouTube. So think about it and give us a hand. I thank you.